Hello everyone and welcome to this video going through Act 2 of An Inspector Calls. So we're picking up from Act 1, which is end with the curtain going down and Gerald and Sheila interrogating each other, taking over the role of the inspector. And it's interesting, the inspector restarts with the exact same word he said at the end of Act 1, well, and leaves it to Gerald. And now we see the interrogation of Gerald. Gerald's trying to get out of this, saying that Sheila's had a long, exciting and tiring day straight away. And are you getting hysterical? Probably. And in fairness, Sheila has good reason to, given the details of her fiancé's affair are coming out and her world has been shattered. This idea of young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things, a direct challenge against the patriarchy from the inspector, this idea of the voice from 1945, post-war, where actually women have seen unpleasant and disturbing things in society in the death of loved ones at World War I and World War II, and this idea that if we protect women from this, we treat women as if they are incapable of experiencing these things, we do them and we do society a disservice. It's overly patronising. So Gerald's inspector, and Gerald, I can't understand that Sheila actually cares about Eva Smith. Now you want to see somebody else put through it because you've been put through it. And Sheila, I must be a selfish, vindictive creature. So Gerald is kind of, he's obfuscating here. He's trying to avoid the truth. He's skirting around what happens. And they have a little kind of argument. The inspector steps in, massively taking charge. A girl died tonight, a pretty lively sort of girl who never did anybody any harm. And the inspector keeps having to remind the Birling family that this girl died a brutal, horrific death, because it forces the family to reflect on the death of the girl, not their kind of petty squabbles, or even worse, not their sense of self-pity. You know, if we do something wrong, sometimes we have a tendency to say, oh, you know, if I could do this again, I would do. But actually, we're not saying that because we would actually do something. We're saying that out of a sense of self-pity to try and let ourselves off the hook a bit easier, rather than taking responsibility. You see, we have to share something. If there's nothing else, we have to share our guilt. They've both done something wrong. Yes, they've committed moral crimes. There's no legal thing, but moral crimes can have a huge consequence if they come out into the public sphere. If Gerald Croft of Crofts Limited, if it comes out that he's having an affair, customers might think twice about going with him. You know, there might be an investigation into him. There might be all sorts of impact that's not legal. You know, he's not going to prison for having an affair. It's a moral crime, but it has a significant impact. I don't understand about you, and there's no reason why you should. This idea of the inspector, he's quite a mysterious character. When it comes to the inspector, we're not concerned with whether he's, in inverted commas, real or not. Some people call him an omniscient third-person narrator. He knows everything about the family before he enters the scene. Quite often in exams, and this is the right way to go with him, he's seen as the voice of Priestley. So when he goes, when he leaves, however he appears in the play, this idea that he is Priestley's mouthpiece or Priestley's proxy. He represents Priestley's views on stage in character form. Some people call him as a voice from 1945, a voice from the future. I don't understand about you because you wouldn't understand about him with what he knows about the family in the future, or this idea of God as well, a godlike character, a deity that brings judgment on the family. That's quite important if you consider the play as a morality play. A lot of the characters are stock characters. They don't change throughout their linear. Mr. Birling, Mrs. Birling. Gerald does to a degree in this act, but then goes back to his old ways there. And so this inspector is a morally good character who challenges them in a very similar way to Macduff in Macbeth when you come to year 11. Mrs. Birling then appears and starts to kind of have a situation here with the inspector where she's trying to get Sheila out of the room, but also challenge the inspector. You seem to have made a great impression on the child inspector. We often do on the young ones. They're more impressionable. Older versus younger characters is often a key theme, and it's an interesting point with the female characters. We judge Mrs. Birling negatively, quite rightly as well, because of her despicable acts towards Eva Smith. But it's really important that Mrs. Birling is a product of her society. Mrs. Birling is pre-women's rights movement. So she would have been born, roughly speaking, in the kind of the mid-1800s. So she predates the rise of women's rights towards the end of the 1800s, and you know, things like the suffragette movement that we see. So as a result of that, because she's born before it, she doesn't understand it, and it won't have applied to her life. So she actually reinforces the patriarchy The reason she covers up for her husband, have to get used to your husband working long hours. The reason she reproaches her children so many times and tells them off is because she is part of the older generation, but Sheila is the newer generation who will have been born in the late 1800s. She is a child of the first generation of feminism. She's a child of the women's rights movement and the suffrage movement, and she understands this move towards equality more than her mother, which is why the inspector makes an impression on the young ones, and he wants to make an impression, Priestley wants to make an impression on the younger people watching this in the audience and challenge those older people in society. Mrs. Birling starts in with girls of that class, showing her direct class prejudice from the start. That class. She views them as negatively subhuman almost, this idea they're not deserving of names or a particular, not the lower class or the working class, it's that class, almost spat out with disgust there, showing her view. And then the Mrs. Birling and Gerald and Sheila all have this kind of semi-argument with the inspector where they're all Mrs. Birling is trying to dominate proceedings. Inspector pulls her up on the fact that Eric drinks too much, something that was in front of Mrs. Birling's eyes because he is spoilt by her parents. He's been steadily drinking too much for the last 2 years. So Sheila starts to tell the inspector about the lies her parents are trying to say and they're trying to get away with. Gerald even supports this as well. And they talk about building up a wall that's sure to be knocked flat. It makes it all the harder to bear because when these things come out for real, if you've been innocent throughout and if you've cooperated with the police, then it's less of a problem. But if you try to disguise this and hide it, then it makes it all the harder to bear because you face that direct punishment. And Mrs. Birling sees a change in her daughter from capitalist to socialist. It's you and not the inspector here who's doing it. And they still believe here that they're not going to, they're going to get away with it here. Mrs. Birling is still trying to get the children out of the room. And it looks like the inspector's about to interrogate Mrs. Birling here. He talks to Mrs. Birling and then he sharply turns on Gerald Croft. Gerald thinks he's got away with the affair here. This is a tactic they use sometimes in Parliament. If people don't want to vote on a particular debate, they'll try and filibuster. They'll try and just take up time in Parliament in the hope that somebody loses their interest in something. And then they'll give it up altogether. And the inspector doesn't, because he turns on Gerald Croft after a couple of pages where they've had this small domestic scene. An exclamation of surprise from Mrs. Birling and Mr. Birling. Gerald, where did you get the idea that I did know her? We've already seen at the start of Act Two, Sheila knows he had an affair. The inspector clearly knows he had an affair from day one, and he's now still trying to hide this as well. And he gave himself away. So we hear about Gerald's affair. So Gerald goes to the Palace Bar, a favourite haunt of women of the town. Women of the town is a reference to prostitutes. And obviously, when we're talking about prostitutes, we're talking about women who are often forced into prostitution as a sole means of supplementing, of supporting their lives, not even supplementing, paying for them to live here. So this idea of women of the town, we get this seedy nature, and this is where the pink and intimate lighting perhaps comes in that's been alluded to earlier on. I didn't propose to stay long down there. I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. So he's talking about the prostitutes who frequent the Palace Bar. The problem with this is, he is as critical as Mrs. Birling of those women. He's critical, he treats them like a subclass. And it's this idea of do they have a choice? And also, they are hard-eyed and dough-faced because these poor women, the only thing that they have available to them is to sell their bodies, to sell their sex as trade. And of course they've been hard-eyed and dough-faced because the things that they will have seen in their lives in order for them to survive. These are people, they're not working class, they're below that working class in society. And Gerald is critical of them here as well. In a way that he puts Eva Smith, Daisy Renton on a pedestal here in this situation. But actually, she will be a hard-eyed, dough-faced woman. By the time that Eric has his way with her, this is what she becomes. Through time, this is what she'd become as a result of her treatment by society. If you don't give people proper jobs, if you don't support them actively, then this is what they're forced to do. And it's quite an interesting quotation. It's quite a small detail, but an interesting one. My God, and Gerald, perhaps he genuinely cares about her. He gets distressed. I've suddenly realised that she's dead. So he does seem to genuinely care about her. He gets genuinely distressed and upset, which contrasts with his behaviour in Act 3 when he's trying to actively cover up. He feels this. He learns something from this. But then he goes back to his old ways in Act 3, and I think that's quite important because he's the one who, Sheila arguably, but he genuinely has a connection with her and he feels this, but then it kind of instantly goes. They talk about Gerald Megarty, who was the alderman, half drunk and goggle-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. So you've got a society in Bromley. Mr. Birling, it's been alluded to his affairs. Gerald, Joe Megarty, Eric, who we see later on. Every male character, bar the inspector in an Inspector Calls, behaves in a way towards women of treating them like a commodity, an object solely for sex. And I think that's quite an important kind of role here as well. It's interesting that they're talking about protecting Sheila from such things, but actually they're perfectly happy for her to get married to Gerald, who has admitted to having affairs and treating women as disposable pleasures. So they talk about this idea of the view of women in 1912 society by women. They go to the county hotel, gets her a drink and something to eat, and Gerald is interested in her because she felt I was interested and friendly. And was he actually interested, or is it a front, an appearance? Was he actually interested and friendly in her, or did he just want to talk to her purely for sex? He insisted on Daisy moving into these rooms and made her take some money to keep her going there. So a friend gives him a house. He moves Daisy into the rooms, and he says this carefully to the inspector. I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so I could make love to her. Gerald's story is that he falls in love with her, and she sees that she's poor, gives her some money, gives her a place to live. The problem with this is, if you look at the facts semi-objectively, Gerald sees this woman who is, to all intents and purposes, a prostitute, installs her into these rooms and gives her money, which is prostitution, it's soliciting, which is a crime, a legal crime. Now, there's probably not enough evidence to charge Gerald with that. His contacts, he'd have a particularly good lawyer, but it's really interesting. We treat this as a moral crime in the play, but actually what Gerald does is a form of prostitution with Eva Smith. I became at once the most important person in her life, you understand. This is what attracts Gerald. He is attracted to the idea of the fact that Eva Smith is entirely dependent on her, not her herself. She felt I was interested in Friendly, not I was interested in Friendly, she felt I was. And this idea that he gets attracted to the idea of her becoming, him becoming the most important person in her life. This power imbalance is what attracts him. This idea of having his ego massaged rather than actually being in love with her as well. And Birling protests against my daughter, a young unmarried girl, is being dragged into this. But there's an irony there. First of all, Eva Smith is being dragged into this, a young unmarried girl. And also, she's been dragged into this by Birling and his desire to push the union and push their marriage. Gerald's the wonderful fairy prince, this idea of ego versus love. He is the kind of the white male saviour in that situation for Eva Smith, and he enjoys that, he gets off on that. And actually, the affair was always going to end. Mrs. Birling calls it a disgusting affair. And she calls it disgusting because it's so against her principles as a woman. The irony, I suppose, is Mr. Birling perhaps has affairs but doesn't get caught, but it's against her principles as a woman, but it's also against her worldview. Her worldview is to support the patriarchy and support the family home, and this idea of somebody jeopardising that is disgusting to her. But also the idea of a man from an upper class having an affair with somebody from the underclass is disgusting to her as well, reinforcing those class structures. So Eva Smith knew it couldn't last, hadn't expected it to last. She didn't blame me at all. I wish to God she had now. Gerald always knew it was going to end. He knew that they were never, the class structures of 1912 Britain were never going to make it so that Gerald Croft, son of Lord and Lady Croft, could marry a lowly prostitute. It was never going to happen. And so Gerald is doubly, wrong for this. He gives her this ideal life. He gives her all these great things, but then he knows it's going to end at some point. And yes, you could argue he gives her a quality of life and cares at her, but that quality of life was always transient. And is that not a cruelty of itself? You promise somebody something, you make them believe they're going to have this life together, and then you pull the plug on it because you know you're going to go back to Sheila. She goes away to the seaside. It's interesting that she goes to the seaside to be alone, to be quiet, to remember all that happened between you. I was reading a book the other day about seasides. The idea of a seaside in 1912 Britain would be a place devoid of class. People from the upper class, people from the lower class would come together and have fun at the seaside. Seaside is a place of pleasure, but that pleasure is always transient. The pleasure won't last. You know, you have a fun day out at the seaside, then you've always got to go home. And ultimately, when you go home, you go back to the reality of life. And when Daisy Renton takes some money from Gerald, goes off to the seaside, has some fun, but then she comes back to the even harsher treatment of Eric and Mrs. Birling as well. So we'll keep going through. And here we've got a situation. The ring is handed back by Sheila. And Gerald was expecting this. And the question is for how long he was expecting that, given that he knows he's had an affair. And then working through here, Birling is trying to defend her. You know, he's heard his future son-in-law admit to having an affair. You must understand that a lot of young men, this idea of a capitalist, Birling sees the pound signs literally slipping away as Gerald leaves the marriage there. And this idea that Gerald kind of goes off. And then Mrs. Birling is starting to be interrogated. And look at the exchange. You don't get an extract in the exam, but look at the exchange here. Terse one-line exchanges. This is the classic. If you're interrogated by the police, no comment, no comment, no comment, no comment. I'm a public man, and public men have responsibilities as well as privileges. He reminds Birling of his obligations. Birling wants fame for the wrong reasons, just for being this particular role. He wants the privilege without taking any responsibility, which is a classic kind of upper class view of the time. So we hear about Mrs. Birling's interrogation and the idea that she's at the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, and Daisy Renton went there some 2 weeks ago. Bear in mind, the Bromley Women's Charity Organisation, the whole role of that organisation is to give charity, to give aid to women in Bromley. So whether you like it or not, you must have a pretty good reason to not give aid to a woman who needs charity in Bromley. You know, I think sometimes people look at Mrs. Birling's involvement and we try and give her and cut her a bit of slack. Her job as the chair is to organise people. If you went to a food bank, I know there's rules about when you can go to a food bank. If you went to a food bank and they were like, no, we don't think you can have any food, sorry. You know, you'd rightly be upset. If you went to the government and your benefits were stopped, you'd rightly be upset about that as well, because the whole point of this organisation is to give people charitable aid. And Mrs. Birling is prejudiced from the start. And she admits to this prejudice. And again, it's not a legal crime. She only had herself to blame for poverty. So she has a sense of arrogance because she's fought with Birling. She used my influence to have it refused. She tries to stand up to the expector, but she only makes the case against her worst. There's a sense of dramatic tension here now growing in the audience. We feel this. We feel this aggression between Mrs. Birling and the inspector. And the dramatic tension comes because we know things as an audience that Mrs. Birling doesn't as a mere character. Priestley sets the play up in this way. And the inspector drops, this girl was going to have a child. He saves this detail, or Priestley saves this detail for impact on Mrs. Birling to puncture this bubble of, oh, well, she was poor, she deserved it, she deserved it, she deserved it. And this idea, well, she was going to have a baby. So you've refused aid to a woman who was heavily pregnant. And this was the end. And this sets up the most important piece of dramatic irony as we approach the end of Act Two. I'll tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility. The inspector responds with that doesn't make it any the less yours. Mrs. Birling is refusing to take any responsibility here, so the inspector, Priestley, has to go to drastic measures to make her confess. You've had children. You must have known what she was feeling, and you slammed the door in her face. The aggressive language used. Even Mr. Birling, dubiously, I must say, Sybil, it isn't going to do us much good. Mr. Birling's turning on his own wife here. And she still continues here. And the inspector tries everything. Her position now is that she lies with a burnt out inside on a slab. He tries the aggressive language. He gets aggressive towards Mrs. Birling. What did she say? I'm losing all patience with you people. Normally he used to refer to the lower class, but here the upper class and their behaviour. And it gradually turns out that the money was stolen. And this idea then that as if a girl of that sort, a girl of that class, a girl of that sort would ever refuse money, showing her class prejudice. And it turns out the person has stolen the money. So Mrs. Birling, in her head, she's got this idea of this young, lower-class man who's stolen money to provide for his young, lower-class wife. She's completely oblivious to the one character we've not seen interrogated yet. And this sense of dramatic irony and tension grows and grows. She still accepts no blame at the end. She's sorry that she's died, but not sorry for her part in that. And they keep going through. And this idea, I blame the young man who was the father of a child she was going to have. If he didn't belong to her class and was some drunken young idler, it's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. Her prejudice actually condemns her own son in this situation. And Sheila realises first, she's got this sense of insight over the family. She comes to realise things that Priestley wants the audience to realise. Mother, stop. And Mrs. Birling turns on the inspector. It's time for you to do your duty. You really would be doing your duty instead of asking unnecessary questions. And she sits there, she's triumphant. The moment of her hubris, the maximum moment of her confidence and triumph is her downfall. Her hamartia, her fatal flaw is her arrogance, that she will get away with these things, that she's done nothing wrong. And the inspector turns her words on her here. And then she finally realises towards the end of Act 2. But surely, it's ridiculous. She exchanged a frightened glance. Even if Mrs. Birling doesn't say it, she is frightened by the inspector's behaviour. In the same way that in this act, you've got two of the most stubborn characters in the play. Gerald, who feels the death of Daisy Renton and becomes distressed. And now Mrs. Birling, who is frightened. Even though she stood up to the inspector, she's frightened. Birling is terrified now, like his wife. They've been made to realise that what they've done is wrong. To the point that Birling is thunderstruck by the end of this. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. She's agitated. The inspector, through his actions, through his words, has forced them to reflect on their behaviour. The curtain falls, and this dramatic tension that's been built throughout Mrs. Birling, Priestley deliberately uses her to build this sense of tension. It reaches a crescendo at the end of Act 2. I'm not going to say the old cliffhanger. Curtain falls at the end of Act 2, and we've got this situation where we know, and the characters have come to the sudden realisation, some sooner than others, that Eric is the one who's had the affair. And Mr. and Mrs. Birling are afraid at the end of Act 2. They need to feel this way to change their ways. Sometimes you can reason with people. You can say to people, look, the way you behaved towards that young woman was completely wrong when you were trying that dress on and you made her feel terrible. You made her feel okay, but actually you used her. You shouldn't have sacked her. She's got every right to ask for more money. Sometimes you can reason with people. When you can't reason with people, you need to play with their emotions. You need to manipulate them to feel a certain way to try and change their behaviour. And what becomes really important in Act 3, you've got this great moment of tension at the end of Act 2, one of the key moments of the play. In Act 3, it's very much a case of once we've seen Eric's interrogation, it's how do these characters actually reflect on the lessons they're supposed to have learned. We know it's Eric, who's the father. As an audience, we get that dramatic tension that's heightened. Mrs. Birling doesn't. She's too arrogant to consider it. And we've seen Gerald and we've seen Mrs. Birling interrogated here. How do those two characters, one from the younger generation, one from the older generation, how do they then reflect on their behaviour as the play reaches its kind of climax in Act 3? So Act 2, dramatic tension, the interrogation of Gerald, the interrogation of Mrs. Birling, and this moment of great dramatic tension as the curtain falls at the end of Act 2.